The armor was clearly not meant for a human spine, but Johal picked it up anyway. She told herself later that it was a professional reflex. 17 years of field engineering, 12 of them on vessels that weren't built for human hands, had trained her to reach for unfamiliar hardware before her brain fully registered it as unfamiliar. That was the story. It was not a lie, exactly. It was just not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the thing was beautiful, and she wanted to touch it. The Vethkari Armory occupied the northeastern corner of Depot Shathvel, behind 2 doors that should have been locked and 1 checkpoint that should have been staffed. The checkpoint officer had been called away. The doors had been left on manual cycle during a maintenance window that would last another 40 minutes. Johal had been waiting in the liaison bay for 3 hours because her Vethkari counterpart had the same relationship with scheduling that most species had with optional paperwork. She had a multi-tool, a half-eaten protein bar, and no particular reason not to walk around. The Vethkari were hexapedal, which meant their architecture assumed 6 points of contact with the ground at any given time. Doorframes came in sets of 2, one at 2 meters, one at 3.5. Shelving units bracketed both heights. Johal had learned to navigate it like an obstacle course, ducking and weaving, treating their corridors as a series of friendly puzzles. The armory was different. The armory was built around 1 central plinth, and on the plinth sat the battle shell. She knew what it was because she'd read the orientation files. The Vethkari called it Times Veshkarath, which translated approximately as the shell that remembers. Semi-sentient exosuit, neurological bonding protocol. Carrier signal broadcast through a proprietary frequency in the sub-vocal range. Each shell was paired to a single warrior through a ceremony called the resonance rite. The pairing lasted the warrior's life. Unpaired shells were kept in a state of low activity, cycling through maintenance routines, waiting. The file had noted that unpaired shells in standby mode were generally safe to approach. It had not specified what approach meant, and Johal had always preferred field verification over documentation. The shell was smaller than she expected. The Vethkari averaged 2.4 meters at their primary shoulder joint, but the armor sat compact on its plinth, curved inward like a closed fist. Carapace panels folded over each other in overlapping arcs of something that looked like carbon ceramic, but flexed slightly when she leaned close and blew on it. A deep, metallic, blue-black, iridescent at the edges in a way that made it look wet, though it wasn't. Heat came off it in slow pulses, like a sleeping animal's breathing. She should not have touched it. She touched it. The sensation traveled up through her fingers and into the bones of her wrist before her brain finished processing that she'd made contact. Not electric, not cold, but something in between. A frequency that her nervous system did not have a category for. The shell shifted, not dramatically. 1 panel unfolded, maybe 4 centimeters, like an eye opening. Johal pulled her hand back. Her heart rate was approximately 140 beats per minute, which she noted the way she noted equipment readings. Fast. Compensating. The shell vibrated. Low. Below hearing. Right at the threshold where she felt it in the back of her teeth. She had a colleague, a xenoacoustics researcher named Papadimitriou, who had once explained to her that certain Vethkari carrier frequencies operated in the sub-20 Hz range, below human hearing but within human tactile sensation, that it was theoretically possible for a human to receive a Vethkari shell's bonding name broadcast not as sound but as a resonance in the denser bones of the body. She was thinking about that when the armor said her name. Not Johal. It didn't know that. It said something else, a vibration that started in her molars and moved up through her jaw. A syllable that had no equivalent in galactic standard, but that her nervous system filed under the category of time self, and so she experienced it as her name being spoken, the way you experience someone touching your shoulder in the dark. Rig. Okay, she said, to the armor, because she didn't know what else to say. Okay. Hi. The panel that had opened a crack unfolded further. 2 more followed it. Overseer Cheth found her 6 minutes later. He had 4 of his 6 limbs raised in the Vethkari equivalent of alarm, which looked, to human eyes, like someone falling upward. His bioluminescent throat markings had gone pale. The armor was half open around Johal's torso. She had not put it on intentionally. It had simply arranged itself there, and she had not moved away, and it was humming at a frequency that the depot's monitoring system had logged 3 alerts about before Cheth had overridden them manually. He stood in the doorway for what Johal estimated was 4 seconds. A long time, for someone with his rank and training. "That armor," he said, in galactic standard, "should have rejected you." Johal looked down at the shell panels resting against her ribcage. They were warm. They had matched their curve to her human spine with a precision that no piece of alien hardware had ever managed without a calibration protocol. "I think maybe it didn't," she said. Cheth's throat markings cycled through 3 colors she didn't have names for. His posture did something complicated. She'd spent enough time with Vethkari to read the basic states: aggression, deference, calculation, but this one was new. She filed it under times unknown, probably important. He did not arrest her. He did not bow. He stood in the doorway of his own armory and looked at a human engineer wearing a sacred battle shell that should have alarmed and locked and expelled her on contact. And he appeared to be experiencing some difficulty deciding what category to put her in. The armor hummed against her ribs. Patient. Like it had been waiting for someone to show up, and wasn't particularly surprised that it had taken this long. The armor liked her more than it had ever liked its last 6 bearers. Cheth knew this because the shell's resonance log was part of the depot's public records, and he had read every entry twice in the 3 hours since the incident, looking for a precedent. There was none. The shell had accepted each of its previous Vethkari bearers through the proper resonance rite ceremony, blood frequency alignment. The 17-stage bonding sequence and its log had recorded each acceptance as a functional baseline. No warmth, no preference. The shell did its work and kept its own counsel. The log entry for Johal read differently. The notation field, which was supposed to record signal strength and neurological compatibility metrics, contained a single Vethkari glyph that Cheth had never seen used in a technical document. It translated, loosely, as times recognized. He had not shown Johal that entry. The severance ritual was supposed to take 40 minutes. It required an overseer of his rank, the proper frequency dampeners, and a willing participant who remained still. Johal was willing. She was not particularly still. She kept tilting her head and touching the shell's edge plates with the flat of her thumb, the way a technician checks a seal. But she was cooperating, which was more than some Vethkari warriors managed. He completed the first stage of the ritual. The shell did not respond. He completed the second stage, with the harmonic rods, and the shell's resonance frequency actually increased. One of the junior soldiers watching from the corridor doorway made a sound that Cheth would have to address later. "What does that part do?" Johal asked, pointing at the harmonic rod. "It severs the carrier signal. It tells the shell the bond is concluded." "And it's vibrating more now?" "Yes." "Huh." She looked at the rod. She looked at the shell. She reached up and put her palm flat against the carapace in a gesture that had no ritual significance whatsoever, and said, in a quiet voice that was clearly not directed at Cheth, "Hey, it's okay. He's not trying to hurt you. It's a protocol. Just relax." The frequency dropped. Not to baseline, but down. Cheth held the harmonic rod and experienced a sensation he associated with watching structural equations fail. Something that should have been impossible was not only occurring, but appearing to respond to casual conversation. "How did you do that?" he asked. "I don't know exactly." Johal turned the shell's edge plate over in her fingers. "Old hardware sometimes spikes when you try to force a disconnect. You have to talk it down. Tell it the disconnect isn't a failure. Tell it you'll be back." She paused. "Does that make sense? For a shell? It did not make sense. It also appeared to be working. He attempted the third stage. The shell locked. Completely, all panels sealed. Carrier signal flatlined on his monitoring equipment for exactly 1.3 seconds. And then it reopened with a sound like a long exhale and settled back against Johal's torso with a resonance signature his instruments couldn't classify. In the doorway, 3 junior soldiers were now watching. One of them was recording. "I don't think it wants to be disconnected," Johal said. She didn't sound triumphant. She sounded like someone reading a diagnostic result they hadn't expected. Is that possible? For a shell to have a preference? 5. It was not supposed to be possible. Shells had carrier instincts, bonding protocols, protective subroutines. They did not have preferences. The doctrine was clear. Cheth was not looking at the doctrine right now. He was looking at a human engineer who had wandered into a restricted armory, touched a sacred weapon out of apparent incurable nosiness, and accidentally performed what he was recognizing, this now. With some delay of functional counterbond right. The talking down. The palm placement. The reassurance. Not in the ritual form. Not with the correct frequencies. But structurally identical in every way that seemed to matter to the shell. She had not bonded with a weapon. She had befriended one. The shell chose its warriors through blood frequency and lineage resonance. Through generations of Vethkari who had carried the genetic markers that the shell's scanning protocol recognized. That was the doctrine. That was the foundation of the entire resonance tradition. Johal had no lineage in the shell's database. She had a multi-tool on her belt and grease under her fingernails, and apparently a neurological frequency that the shell had decided, unilaterally, was close enough. The elder arrived at the 16th hour. Her name was Threshvel Anther, which translated approximately as the one who remembers before the current remembering, and she had served as doctrinal arbiter for the Vethkari military coalition for 63 years. She was 4 meters long in her primary configuration, and her bioluminescent markings were fully activated, which Cheth knew meant she was thinking in ways that she was not yet prepared to share. She looked at Johal for a long time. She looked at the shell, which was still humming against Johal's ribcage. "What is the human's function?" she asked Cheth. "Field engineer, repair liaison." She was assigned to our depot to service the tertiary communication arrays. She fixes broken things. That is her function, Elder. Threshvel Anthar looked at the shell's resonance log on the display Cheth held out to her. She looked at the glyph in the notation field, times recognized times, for a long moment. "The shell has been waiting 11 years for a new bearer," she said, "since warrior Vethkala fell." "Yes, Elder. It waited 11 years. She looked at Johal, who was listening carefully and touching the shell's edge plate with her thumb again. And then a human wandered into the armory, and it recognized her in 3 minutes. Cheth said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "The trial of resonance," Threshvel Anthar said. "Tomorrow. If the human passes, the shell's judgment stands. If she fails," she paused, "the shell will be decommissioned. It has clearly developed an error in its selection protocol. We will not risk it bonding to further unsuitable candidates." Johal had stopped touching the edge plate. Her face was doing something complicated. "What happens to the shell?" she said slowly. "If it's decommissioned." Threshvel Anthar regarded her. "It is destroyed." The shell's hum dropped to a register that Cheth felt in his primary shoulder joints. Low. Uncertain. Johal's hand went flat against the carapace again. "Okay," she said to the shell. "Okay, we'll figure it out." Cheth looked at the elder. The elder looked at Johal. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the human appeared to have just promised something. The elder's judgment was simple. If Johal could not prove worthy in the trial of resonance, the armor would be destroyed, rather than dishonored. The trial had 3 stages, designed over 400 years of Vethkari military tradition to test the qualities the shells selected for physical endurance in the carrier frequency field, cognitive adaptation under resonance pressure, and what the doctrine called times harmonization. Times the ability to sync one's neural signature with the shell's carrier wave at full operational intensity. The third stage had been redesigned 16 times. It had broken 3 warriors who had otherwise passed the first 2 cleanly. Johal weighed 61 kilograms, stood 1.7 meters, had 2 functional arms, and no blood frequency markers in any Vethkari database. She had a multi-tool in her left pocket and the shell humming against her ribs. The first stage lasted 12 minutes. It involved navigating a resonance field while the shell's carrier signal cycled through bonding frequencies at increasing intensity. For Vethkari warriors, the stage was demanding but survivable. For Johal, the frequencies hit the subvocal range and set her back teeth aching before the 3rd cycle. By the 6th cycle, she was navigating by feel, eyes watering, the signal doing something to her inner ear that made the floor seem to tilt at angles that disagreed with her visual input. She completed the course. The judges conferred. By Vethkari metrics, she had placed in the lowest functional tier. Not a pass. She wiped her eyes and went to the 2nd stage. The 2nd stage was cognitive, a series of tactical problems run through the shell's command interface, which operated on Vethkari spatial logic. Vethkari warriors processed space in 6 axes of simultaneous awareness, 1 for each limb. Johal processed it in 4 axes and compensated by slowing down, working methodically, treating each interface problem as a disassembly puzzle. She got the right answers. She got them in the wrong order. The judges conferred again. Not a pass. She stood between the 2nd and 3rd stage platforms and looked at the shell on the trial harness, where it had been mounted for testing, half open, panels arranged in the configuration it had adopted when she was wearing it. She was breathing through her mouth because her nose had not fully recovered from the inner ear interference. Cheth stood at the railing above, observer status only. He had not spoken to her since the staging room. Elder Threshvel Anthar stood beside him, expression unreadable. "Okay," Johal said, to herself or to the shell, or to both. 2 down. Last one. She stepped onto the 3rd stage platform. The harmonization stage required the bearer to synchronize with the shell's carrier wave at full operational intensity. Not navigate through it, not work around it, but match it. Neural signature meeting shell signal in the specific alignment that meant the bond was complete and functional. For Vethkari warriors who had trained their whole lives, who carried the genetic markers, who had completed the resonance rite in the proper form, the stage was still hard. It had broken 3 of them. The shell went to full intensity. Johal's vision whited at the edges. The frequency hit her at the bone level, jaw, sternum, the long bones of her arms, and her nervous system tried to sort it into categories it didn't have. She stayed on the platform. She'd spent 12 years working in field environments that tried to shake her loose, and she had learned to find the signal inside the interference, to identify the pattern underneath the noise. There was a pattern. She found it. It was not comfortable. Exactly. But it was recognizable. The same thing she'd felt when the shell first touched her. In the armory. Before she'd known what it was. Her nervous system didn't have a category for it, but it had a file. It had labeled the file times self. She synced. Not perfectly. Not the way a Vethkari warrior synced. From training and blood frequency, and 17 stages of ceremonial preparation, she synced the way she fixed things, finding the 2 systems that needed to connect, and figuring out what they had in common, and leaning into that, until the connection held. The shell's carrier wave, at full intensity, was trying to broadcast its identification signal. It was broadcasting into a nervous system that couldn't receive Vethkari frequencies in the standard way. She couldn't receive them as sound. She received them as vibration, as the particular quality of resonance in the denser bones, as the thing she'd filed under times, self-times, since the armory. She leaned into it. The shell's intensity spiked, and then, instead of the lockout that was supposed to follow an incompatible sync attempt, it adjusted. Johal felt it shift, felt the frequency recalibrate against her specific nervous system, the way she'd felt hardware handshake after a long negotiation. The shell was not accepting her Vethkari frequency markers. It was generating new ones. It was writing a protocol for her. Then the cascade alarm hit. The shell's structural integrity monitors spiked red across every display in the chamber. 11 years of storage, one improper maintenance cycle, a microfracture in the primary power cell that no one had caught because the shell had been in low-activity standby and the fracture had been too small to flag. It was not small anymore. At full operational intensity, the power cell was failing. The shell was going to shut down. In a Vethkari trial chamber, with an incompatible human bearer, in front of an elder who had authorized its decommissioning as the alternative outcome, the judges were already moving to abort the trial. In 10 seconds, by protocol, the stage would be cleared and the shell would be removed for assessment. And the assessment would conclude what it would conclude. Johal dropped to her knees on the platform and put both hands on the shell's casing. She had the multi-tool out before she had a conscious plan. The power cell housing on a Vethkari battle shell was not designed for human tool interfaces. But she had spent 12 years adapting human tools to alien hardware. And the basic principle was the same everywhere. Find the access point, identify the fault, create a bypass. She found the microfracture by feel. The shell guided her. It knew where it was hurt. It had known for 11 years, and she talked while she worked, the same way she always talked while she worked. A low, continuous commentary that was partly instruction to herself and partly reassurance to the hardware. Okay, found it. That's a bad crack. Not as bad as the tertiary coupler on the Times Veth-Shalan Times was. You remember? No, you don't remember that. That was a different shell. That's fine. I'm going to reroute the draw through the secondary, and that's going to hurt, but it's going to hold. It hurt her too. The rerouted signal went through the bond, and she felt the feedback in her jaw and her sternum, a pressure like biting down on a cold metal rod. She stayed on it. The cascade alarm dropped from critical to warning. The warning held steady. The shell's resonance signal, which had been fragmenting as the cell failed, pulled back together into a coherent broadcast. The trial judges had stopped moving. The shell completed its sync attempt. Not a Vethkari sync, something else. Something that the monitoring equipment recorded as an anomalous waveform with no entry in the protocol library. The shell's carrier wave and Johal's nervous system, making something up together because neither of them fit the existing categories. She sat back on her heels on the trial platform. Her hands were shaking slightly. 7.2 millikelvin fever. Response from the feedback. Probably. She'd been through worse. The judges conferred for a long time. Then Elder Threshvel Anthar descended from the observer's railing to the trial floor, which she had not done in 40 years of arbitrations. She walked to the platform. She looked at Johal for a long moment, and then she looked at the shell, which was resting against Johal's palms and humming at the low frequency that Johal's nervous system filed under Time's content. The first stage, Threshvel Anthar said, was not passed. No, Johal said. The second stage was not passed. No. The third stage. The elder paused. The third stage has no applicable scoring metric. Johal waited. The shell's power cell should have caused a shutdown event. It did not. The cascade failure was arrested by manual intervention during an active harmonization attempt, while the bearer maintained the sync. Threshvel Anthar was quiet for a moment. No Vethkari warrior has ever done that. The reason is that no Vethkari warrior has ever thought to do that. When a shell begins to fail, you attempt to exit the bond. That is the protocol. That is the training. I didn't know the protocol, Johal said. I know. The elder looked at her for a long time. You are not a warrior. I know. The shell did not choose a warrior. Thresh Velanthar looked at Cheth, who had come down from the railing at some point and was standing at a distance that Johal recognized. Now, as the Vethkari posture for formal witness, ready to speak, ready to be heard, the shell chose a keeper. Cheth spoke. His voice was level. I testify that the human Johal entered the armory without hostility or intent to claim. I testify that the shell's bonding response was immediate and unprompted. I testify that during the cascade failure, the human's intervention preserved a Vethkari artifact that would otherwise have been lost. He paused. I recommend recognition. Thresh Velanthar looked at him for a long moment. There was a weight in that look that Johal couldn't fully read, but Cheth held it without moving. Later, Johal would learn what it had cost him. Overseers who made floor recommendations in a trial of this nature were formally removed from command pending doctrinal review. The process took 8 months. Cheth had known that before he opened his mouth. The elder granted the armor, not as a warrior's bond, as a keeper's trust, a category that had not existed in Vethkari doctrine before today, and would have to be written into it now. Johal walked out of the trial chamber with a suit of alien battle armor sealed against her ribcage, warm, humming at a frequency her nervous system filed under time's home, and a Vethkari elder watching her go with an expression that Johal couldn't categorize. There was not yet a word, in any Vethkari dialect, for what she was. There would be. She took the shell back to the depot's maintenance bay, because the power cell still needed proper repair, and she had the tools and the time, and the shell had been patient long enough. She set it on the workbench and started pulling out components, and the shell opened its panels one by one to give her better access, like someone exhaling. Finally, after holding their breath for a very long time, she worked. The shell hummed. Somewhere outside, Cheth was filing paperwork. The galaxy had not been watching. That was fine. It would catch up.